Hey guys, tonight we begin with a winter problem that sounds almost impossible now. How Great Plains settlers survived blizzards when there was no phone alert, no weather app, no radar image, and often no useful warning waiting at the farmhouse door. The answer was not that they somehow read every storm perfectly from the sky. They did not. In fact, one of the most dangerous things about a plains blizzard was how quickly ordinary winter weather could become a white wall of wind, cold, and blowing snow. By the late 19th century, the United States did have a federal weather service run through the Army Signal Service, with observations traveling by telegraph and forecasts posted in towns. But that system could be very far from a family living miles out on an exposed claim. So survival depended on something much more local. Fuel already stacked, animals already sheltered, familiar paths, ropes, neighbours, thick walls, stored food, and the judgment to stop travelling before the prairie erased every landmark. If you enjoy quiet history about the ordinary skills that kept people alive, please like, subscribe, and comment with the winter hardship you want us to explore next. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing to understand is that a Great Plains blizzard was not simply a heavy snowfall. Snow could be falling lightly, or sometimes much of what blinded you had already fallen earlier and was being lifted from the ground. The real danger came when strong wind took loose snow and turned the open prairie into a moving screen. A barn that was easy to see in calm weather might disappear. A fence line could vanish. A person could walk past a house, keep going, and not realize the mistake until the wind had swallowed the tracks behind them. That made distance deceptive. Settlers measured their world in miles, but blizzards could reduce survival to yards. The trip from a house to a stable might be short enough to make every warning seem excessive, yet long enough to become dangerous if visibility collapsed. Historical accounts from severe storms repeatedly describe people becoming lost surprisingly close to buildings. The problem was not ignorance of where the barn stood. It was that wind, darkness, drifting snow, and cold removed the ordinary cues that told a person whether they were walking straight. So one of the simplest survival tools was a rope. A rope between buildings could turn an invisible route into something you could physically hold. On farms where tending livestock could not simply stop because the weather had become dangerous, a fixed line gave a person a way to reach a barn and, more importantly, find the house again. Similar logic appeared in emergencies involving schools and neighbouring shelters. The point was not that every homestead had a permanent blizzard rope stretched across the yard. Practices varied, and later retellings sometimes make neat legends out of messy events. But the underlying method was practical. When sight failed, replace vision with touch. The house itself mattered just as much. Early settlers did not all live in the same kind of home. Some had frame houses. Some occupied dugouts. Across areas where timber was scarce, many families built with sod, cutting thick blocks of prairie earth and stacking them into heavy walls. A sod house could be damp, dirty, crowded, and full of inconveniences that rarely survive into nostalgic pictures. Yet those thick earthen walls had one useful winter quality. They offered mass and insulation against the wind outside. On an exposed plain, where a poorly sealed wooden structure could leak cold air through every crack, simply stopping the wind was a major advantage. But a windproof room was not enough if the stove went cold. Fuel was a constant calculation because much of the plains did not offer settlers the easy firewood supply they might have known further east. Wood could be scarce or expensive. Families used what the landscape and farm produced. Dried animal dung, commonly called buffalo chips or cow chips, could be burned. In some places, settlers twisted hay tightly into compact bundles for stove fuel. It was repetitive work, and during hard winters it could become part of the daily machinery of staying alive. Twist, feed the stove, save what you could, and do it again. This is where the romantic picture of frontier independence begins to shrink into something more physical. You survived a blizzard partly because you had done work before the blizzard arrived. You had hauled or gathered fuel, you had stored flour, grain, potatoes, preserved meat, or whatever your household could afford and produce. You had repaired a roof, you had banked earth or snow around vulnerable walls. You knew which door drifted shut first. You knew whether the livestock could reach water, whether the well mechanism froze, and whether the nearest neighbour was half a mile away or several miles away. None of this predicted a storm. It made predictions slightly less necessary. And even then, preparation had limits. The famous blizzard of January 12, 1888, often called the Schoolchildren's blizzard, exposed those limits with terrible clarity. The day had begun unusually mild in many places. Then conditions changed rapidly as a powerful cold front swept across the northern and central plains. Temperatures plunged, wind rose, and blowing snow destroyed visibility. Because children were already in one-room schools and adults were already away from home working or travelling, the timing was especially dangerous. It is tempting to tell that story as proof that settlers had no warning system at all. That is too simple. The signal service existed, forecast information existed, but information moving by telegraph to towns was not the same thing as an immediate warning reaching every isolated school, farm, wagon, or person standing outside. The technology of forecasting had begun to exist before the technology of universal delivery. That gap forced people to make decisions from whatever was physically in front of them. A falling barometer might mean something to a station observer that many households had no instrument. A sudden shift in wind, thickening cloud, unusual warmth, a hard northern horizon, or the behaviour of experienced neighbours might suggest trouble, but none of these signs was a magic code. Prairie residents accumulated weather knowledge because they had to, yet local experience could still fail when a storm moved faster or behaved more violently than expected. The most reliable rule was often less impressive. Do not create unnecessary distance between yourself and shelter. That sounds obvious from a warm room. On a working farm it was not. Animals still needed attention. Water still had to be carried. Children still attended school. People visited towns, hauled supplies, collected fuel, delivered mail, and crossed open ground because winter did not suspend ordinary life. Every trip involved a judgment about whether the weather was merely unpleasant or about to become dangerous. And that judgment, more than any heroic trick, is where survival on the plains really begins. The difficulty was that the same decision could save one group and kill another. On January 12, 1888, that problem was repeated across hundreds of farms and country schools. The morning had been unusually mild in much of Nebraska and Dakota Territory. In some places, children had been outside during the noon recess. Adults were working away from home, and livestock were out. Then the wind shifted, the temperature fell, and the ordinary geography of the countryside began to disappear. The storm did not wait for families to gather themselves into sensible places. A one-room schoolhouse could be both refuge and trap. It had walls, a stove, and perhaps a supply of fuel, but it might have almost no food, and the fuel pile might not last through a long night. Parents knew their children were there. Children knew home might be only a mile or two away. A teacher, often quite young, suddenly had to decide whether to keep everyone inside or try to reach a nearby farmhouse before conditions became worse. That is why the Schoolchildren's blizzard produced stories that seem contradictory. Some people lived because they stayed. Others lived because they moved. Some died after leaving a building that initially seemed safe. Others had to leave because the building itself was failing. Minnie Freeman became the most famous Nebraska example. She was still a teenager, teaching in rural Valley County. According to the historical account later placed on a state marker, the wind tore the roof from her sod schoolhouse. Remaining inside was no longer the safe option. With 13 pupils in her care, she led them toward a farmhouse about half a mile away. Accounts describe the children being tied together in a line so that no one could simply disappear into the blowing snow. All 13 reached shelter. The story spread quickly and eventually became larger than the event itself. Freeman was celebrated in newspapers and in a popular song called 13 were saved, or Nebraska's fearless maid. That later fame is worth noticing because frontier survival stories often became cleaner in memory than they had been in real life. A community wanted a hero, and Freeman's rescue supplied one. But the practical lesson was less romantic. Her school had ceased to function as shelter, so she replaced a failing building with a controlled movement toward a known refuge. Not far away, in the same broad disaster, another teacher faced a similar decision with a very different result. Lois Royce was teaching near Plainview, Nebraska. She tried to reach a farmhouse with 3 young children. They did not make it. Royce survived, but suffered severe frostbite and later lost both legs below the knees. The comparison is uncomfortable because it refuses to give us a simple rule. Leaving was not foolish in one case and wise in another. The outcome depended on distance, visibility, clothing, exact timing, the strength of the people moving, and whether the shelter being left could actually hold. For a teacher, there was another problem. Country schools were not merely classrooms. The teacher was often responsible for keeping the stove going and doing the basic work that kept the building usable. In North Dakota, historical education records describe teachers handling both instruction and janitorial duties, including keeping the schoolhouse warm. So, when a storm arrived, the adult in the room was not simply supervising children. That person was also managing the one piece of equipment that might keep the room habitable. Fuel, therefore, became a clock. If the school had enough wood, coal, lignite, twisted hay, or whatever it normally burned, waiting could be the best choice. If it did not, every hour reduced the margin. The same calculation existed in farmhouses. A family might be perfectly safe from the wind and still have a serious problem if the fuel was outside in a shed, crib, or stack that could no longer be reached easily. North Dakota historical materials record a remarkably broad range of stove fuels on pioneer homesteads. Witch wood, buffalo or cow chips, lignite, corn cobs, and twisted hay. Mrs. T.C. Porter of St. Paul, Nebraska, left a particularly useful account. Her husband had gone to town with a load of corn when the storm arrived. She was at home with the children, but the mild weather had meant they had little fire going and, as she later wrote to relatives, nothing immediately available to burn. She eventually bundled herself up and went to the crib for corn cobs. The wind knocked her down. She crawled back toward the house, dragging the fuel with her. That small trip explains something large about blizzard survival. Preparedness was not only a matter of owning supplies, it was a matter of where those supplies were when visibility vanished. A pile of corn cobs 50 yards away could become almost inaccessible. A well could be close to the kitchen and still require a dangerous trip. The barn might contain animals, feed, tools, lanterns, and warmer clothing, yet become separated from the house by a few minutes of exposure. The practical geography of a homestead contracted sharply during a storm. What mattered was not what the family possessed across the property, but what could still be reached. Sometimes people created routes out of features that could be felt rather than seen. Frank Carney, a 20-year-old railroad telegraph operator west of Omaha, later recalled leaving the boxcar that served as his office because he feared the wind might overturn it. He had to reach a depot roughly half a mile away. Instead of trying to navigate by distant landmarks, he walked between newly laid rails. The unfinished trackbed helped him keep direction under his feet. As he neared the depot, he repeatedly reached toward one side, feeling for the platform so he would not walk past it into open country. Eventually, the light from the station window coloured the blowing snow, and he knew he had reached safety. There is no single frontier trick hiding in these stories. There is a pattern of reducing uncertainty. Stay where the stove works. Move only when shelter fails or another danger becomes greater. Keep people physically connected. Follow something solid. Put fuel where you can reach it. Turn a half-mile journey into a sequence of smaller, verifiable steps. One of the harsher Nebraska cases shows why that search for improvised shelter mattered. Teacher Emma Shattuck, caught away from a secure building in Holt County, found refuge in a haystack and remained there from Thursday night until Sunday. She survived the storm itself, but was badly frostbitten and later died after amputations. A haystack was not a proper refuge, but in open country it could interrupt the wind long enough to change the rate at which the body lost heat. And when none of those options were available, settlers sometimes looked for shelter in the landscape itself, using snow, hay, livestock, or even the shape of a drift in ways that sound desperate until you understand how much warmer a few feet out of the wind could be. If a blizzard caught you away from a house, the problem changed immediately. You were no longer trying to keep a room warm. You were trying to make the wind touch less of your body. That distinction mattered because on the Great Plains, wind was often what turned cold into catastrophe. A person standing in the open lost heat far faster than someone pressed against the protected side of a building, bank, haystack, wagon, or drift. Settlers did not need modern wind chill tables to understand this. They learned it through work. The north side of a barn could feel lethal, while the lee side could be merely bitter. A few feet of shelter could determine whether hands stayed useful long enough to perform the next task. This is why haystacks appear again and again in winter accounts. Hay was not a decorative feature of a farm. It was winter feed, stored because horses and cattle could not live on snow. When barns lacked space, hay was stacked outside in large piles. North Dakota historical records note that outside haystacks were common when indoor storage was insufficient. In normal weather, that was simply farm organization. In a blizzard, the same stack could become a wall against the wind. The famous case of teacher Emma Shattuck shows both the usefulness and the limitation of such shelter. During the January 1888 storm in Nebraska, she found refuge in a haystack and remained there from Thursday night until Sunday. The stack helped keep her alive through the storm, but it could not keep her body warm enough to prevent catastrophic frostbite. She later underwent amputations and died. The lesson is not that a haystack was a safe substitute for a house. It was that imperfect shelter could prolong survival when the alternative was complete exposure. Other survivors used the same logic with whatever was available. A wagon could block wind. A cut in the ground could reduce exposure. A railroad embankment could become a crude guide and barrier. A barn full of animals could be warmer than the yard outside, even if the building itself was primitive. The Great Plains farm was full of objects that were useless as shelter in ordinary language, but valuable once the weather made open air the main enemy. Animals changed the equation in another way. Settlers depended heavily on horses and cattle, not only for food or income, but for power. Horses pulled plows, wagons, mowers, and hay racks. Oxen did similar work on some farms. Losing a team could mean more than losing livestock. It could mean losing the ability to plant, haul, travel, or recover economically in spring. That is one reason barns and animal shelter mattered so much. A North Dakota historical material notes that on some homesteads a permanent barn was constructed before a permanent house. But tending livestock during a storm could also lure people into danger. The animal inside a barn might be safe enough. The person walking toward it might not be. A farmer could leave a warm kitchen because he feared cattle would be trapped, horses would go without water, or animals would be exposed to the full force of the storm. Every such trip traded one risk for another. The safest decision for the animals was not always the safest decision for the human being making it. Sometimes livestock themselves survived by turning away from the wind and moving with it. Sometimes they crowded behind whatever protection they could find. Severe plains storms could kill exposed animals in large numbers. During Nebraska's Easter storm of 1873, high winds drove snow through cracks in poorly finished pioneer houses, while snow accumulated on livestock outside and contributed to heavy animal losses. For a homesteader, that meant the storm could continue destroying the farm even while the family sat safely indoors. You could hear animals outside and be unable to reach them. You could know feed was disappearing beneath snow. You could understand that the milk cow, the work team, or the small herd representing years of labour was in danger and still decide not to open the door. That kind of restraint is one of the least dramatic forms of frontier survival. Modern retellings often reward action. Someone ties a rope, digs through a drift, crawls toward a barn, or leads children through whiteout conditions. Those stories are memorable because something visible happens, but many people survived precisely because they stopped doing things. They did not begin the trip. They did not go looking for a missing animal after darkness. They did not leave the schoolhouse because home felt emotionally safer. They waited. Nebraska historical summaries of the 1888 blizzard make this point plainly. Staying in shelter for as long as the blizzard lasted generally proved the better course, and most of those stranded were able to return home afterward. That does not erase the exceptional cases where a roof failed, fuel ran out, or movement became necessary. It simply reminds us that the prairie punished unnecessary motion. And waiting had its own discipline. A family had to resist opening doors repeatedly. Drifting snow could pile against an entrance and blow inside the moment the door moved. Heat escaped quickly. Snow melted from clothing and added moisture to a cramped interior. Children became restless. Adults worried about relatives who had not returned. Someone might suggest walking to a neighbour because the distance seemed small. The hardest part was not always cold. Sometimes it was uncertainty. Without a telephone line into every isolated homestead, a family could have no immediate idea whether a husband in town had taken shelter, whether children were still at school, whether a neighbour had survived, or whether the storm would weaken in 1 hour or 10. The existence of regional forecasting and telegraph communication did not mean that timely information could reach every person already isolated in blowing snow. So households shifted from prediction to endurance. They concentrated their lives around the warmest, usable part of the house. Fuel became something to protect rather than consume carelessly. Wet outer garments had to be dealt with before they froze solid. Food already inside became more valuable than better supplies stored in another building. Water mattered because the well or pump might require exposure to reach. Every ordinary household resource acquired a different value once travel between buildings became dangerous. None of these actions was heroic on its own. Together they formed a survival system. The system worked best when people had prepared before winter: feed near the barn, fuel close to the house, clothing dry, doors repaired, animals sheltered, food stored, and routes between buildings understood. But once the blizzard arrived, the system became smaller and simpler. Protect heat. Protect orientation. Avoid unnecessary exposure. Preserve the ability to make the next decision. And when the storm finally weakened, another danger appeared. The prairie did not return to normal the moment the wind stopped. Buildings could be buried behind enormous drifts. Familiar paths vanished. Animals were missing. Transportation stopped. In the aftermath of the January 1888 storm, Nebraska remained badly disrupted, while isolated farms and communities slowly reconnected, and newspapers began assembling reports from across the region. People who had survived the night now had to dig out, search for neighbours, reopen routes, find livestock, and decide how far they could safely travel across a landscape that snow had physically rearranged. For some families, the first sign of mourning was relief. For others, it was the realization that someone had never come home. And that meant the next phase of surviving a Great Plains blizzard was no longer sheltering from the storm. It was going back out into it. Going back out into it did not mean stepping into the same landscape you had left the day before. A hard plains blizzard could rearrange the surface of a farm overnight. Wind scraped some places nearly bare and packed snow into others until fences, roads, sheds, and shallow depressions disappeared under drifts. The sky might be clear again, but the familiar route to a neighbour's house could now be blocked, buried, or misleading. That made the morning after a storm less like a return to normal and more like a slow reconstruction of where everything was. People began with what they knew. If someone had failed to come home, searchers worked outward from the last reliable point: a schoolhouse, a barn, a road crossing, a neighbour's claim. They looked for tracks where the wind had not erased them, for a fence line showing through the snow, for a dark object interrupting a drift. The problem was that a person could be only a short distance from shelter and still be almost invisible. The January 1888 blizzard left grim examples of that. Rescue and recovery parties were slowed by enormous drifts, and some people who had vanished were not found for days. In remote cases, bodies remained undiscovered much longer. The storm itself might have passed in hours, but the search could continue after the weather had become quiet. That delay mattered for survivors too. Someone who had spent the night in a haystack, barn, wagon, or improvised shelter might still be alive but unable to walk. Frostbitten feet could no longer carry weight. Hands might be too damaged to open a latch or untie a knot. A person could survive the coldest hours and still depend entirely on someone else choosing the correct direction the next morning. Search parties therefore needed local memory more than sophisticated equipment. A row of trees could become a route. Ellen Renefelt, whose recollection was later preserved by the Nebraska Blizzard Club, remembered walking home from school during the 1888 storm with other children and their teacher. Their house was close to the school, and a row of cottonwoods ran along much of the way. They followed those trees. It was a simple piece of landscape knowledge, but in near-zero visibility, one trunk leading to the next could do the work that a visible road normally did. Her father faced a different problem. He had gone to a mill at Lyons to have wheat ground into flour and was caught in the storm while returning with a wagon. One of the horses was an old blind mare that had travelled the road many times. Renefelt remembered that her father loosened the reins and allowed the mare to find the way home. It is the sort of detail that sounds almost too neat, and it comes from a survivor's recollection recorded many decades later. So it should be treated as a remembered account rather than a laboratory test of animal navigation. Still, it reveals something useful about frontier travel. A familiar animal could possess a kind of route memory that mattered when a human driver could no longer see the road. The larger transportation system was not nearly so graceful. Railroads, which had made settlement and market farming possible across much of the plains, could be stopped by the same drifting snow that trapped a wagon in the Black Hills region during the 1888 storm. Cuts along the railroad filled so deeply and densely that passage became impossible. Contemporary reports described locomotives struggling against packed snow and trains being abandoned or held in place. That created a second layer of isolation. A farm might be cut off from town. Then the town itself might be cut off from the next town. Telegraph wires could go down. Trains carrying mail, passengers, food, and newspapers stopped moving. Information about the scale of the disaster arrived unevenly because the storm had damaged the very systems used to report it. This helps explain why a blizzard's human geography could remain uncertain for days. A family might know that one person was missing, but have no idea whether the same thing had happened on 20 neighbouring claims. A town might hear rumours of deaths in one direction, while having no reliable communication from another. Newspapers assembled lists from telegrams, travellers, railroad workers, local officials, and people arriving after routes reopened. Numbers changed as new reports came in. For settlers themselves, the first concern was usually smaller. Dig out the doorway. Reach the animals. Check the neighbour. Find the missing child. A house could be so drifted in that the easiest exit was not necessarily the usual door. Barn entrances had to be cleared before livestock could be moved. Wells and pumps had to be reached. Feed stacks might be buried on one side and exposed on another. Every task used energy, and that mattered because the cold following a blizzard could remain severe even after the wind eased. The January 1888 storm is a particularly good example. In the Black Hills, temperatures continued falling after the main blast, and the days immediately afterward remained intensely cold. So the clear morning was not a safe, mild aftermath. It was simply a different kind of winter emergency. Livestock losses could also reshape a family's future. A dead milk cow meant less food. Dead cattle meant lost capital. Losing horses could remove the power needed to haul, plough, or travel. A settler who survived physically might enter spring with fewer animals, less money, damaged buildings, depleted fuel, and debt that had not disappeared just because the weather had been exceptional. This is one reason survival cannot be measured only by whether someone lived through the night. A blizzard could leave a household alive but economically wounded. Neighbours mattered enormously in that phase. Rural plains settlement encouraged independence because farms were physically separated. But severe weather exposed the limits of doing everything alone. Search parties required people. Digging required people. A frostbitten survivor needed transport. A household that had lost fuel or livestock might need supplies. Children stranded at a school or neighbouring farm could remain there until travel became possible. Renefelt remembered that several schoolchildren stayed at her family's house for days before their parents could collect them. That is a quiet detail, but it captures the actual scale of winter disruption. The children had survived the dramatic part. Then ordinary family life had to stretch around them while roads and travel slowly became usable again. And the landscape taught people what to change before the next storm. A useful line of trees was remembered. A dangerous gap between house and barn became obvious. Fuel stored too far away could be moved closer. Neighbours learned which buildings offered dependable shelter. Children learned that a short walk could become impossible faster than expected. But one lesson was harder to solve locally. No amount of knowing your fence line could tell you what weather was crossing the plains hundreds of miles away. Settlers had developed ways to survive after a blizzard arrived. The next question was whether anyone could warn them before it did. The next step was not to make settlers better at guessing the weather. It was to move information faster than the storm. That idea sounds ordinary now, but in the 1870s it was revolutionary. Before a national weather service existed, one town might know that temperatures had crashed and winds had turned violent, while people hundreds of miles downwind had no idea what was approaching. The telegraph changed that. For the first time, observations from widely separated places could be gathered quickly enough to reveal that weather was moving across the country rather than simply appearing from the local sky. In 1870, the federal government placed a new national weather operation under the U.S. Army Signal Service. Its original congressional mission emphasized taking meteorological observations and warning of dangerous storms, and on November 1, 1870, the new Synchronized National Observing Network began operations. The basic process was surprisingly physical. An observer measured temperature, pressure, wind, precipitation, and other conditions at a fixed time. The information was encoded and sent by telegraph. Reports from many stations could then be compared, allowing forecasters to look for regional patterns. Forecasts, then often called probabilities or indications, could be telegraphed outward again. For the first time, a storm could leave evidence ahead of itself. If temperatures had already collapsed hundreds of miles away, pressure was changing, and powerful winds had begun somewhere upstream. Observations from those places could provide information to communities that had not yet experienced the same conditions. But there was a problem. A forecast in a government office or a telegraph station was not the same thing as a warning inside a sod house 20 miles from town. The Signal Service experimented with ways to bridge that final distance. Newspapers carried weather information. Bulletins could be posted publicly. Signal flags gave warnings of visual form. Historical National Weather Service records note that flags became one of the principal early methods of communicating hazardous weather to the public. That system made sense in a town. A merchant walking down Main Street might notice a signal displayed from a prominent building. A railroad employee might encounter telegraphed information. A newspaper reader could see an official indication. Someone near a depot or commercial centre could hear that colder weather was expected. Now move that person 15 miles onto the prairie. There might be no telephone. There might be no immediate newspaper delivery. The trip to town might happen only when supplies, business, or mail required it. If the warning arrived after a farmer had already left home, if children were already at school, or if the telegraph line failed, the information could become useless precisely when it mattered most. The January 1888 blizzard showed this weakness brutally. The Signal Service was operating in the region, and official weather information was being produced. In the Black Hills, a cold wave warning was issued from St. Paul, but the Western Union telegraph line went down during the storm, preventing the warning from reaching Rapid City when it was needed. The warning eventually arrived after the dangerous change had already taken place. Contemporary newspaper material, preserved by the National Weather Service, records local frustration over the delay. The order instructed the Rapid City Observer to hoist the cold wave signal because temperatures were expected to fall dramatically. But because the wires were down, the order could not get through. The flag went up later. That tiny failure contains almost the entire weakness of 19th century forecasting. The prediction system depended on communication infrastructure. If the wire failed, the warning stopped. If the warning reached town but not the farm, the warning stopped. If a person could not see the flag, read the bulletin, reach the depot, or speak to someone who had received the telegram, the warning stopped. The storm did not. This does not mean the early system was useless. Quite the opposite. It represented a major change in how Americans could understand dangerous weather. A settler no longer had to depend only on what could be seen from the doorstep. Increasingly, weather could be treated as a regional event that had already been observed somewhere else before reaching the local horizon. And the signal service became more ambitious. Forecasts and warnings increasingly became part of public life, especially in communities connected by telegraph and railroad. Rapid City newspapers reported that a local businessman arranged for a set of signal service flags and that daily weather indications were to be displayed from a prominent building on Main Street. The principle was simple. Turn invisible information into something public. A telegraph message could become a flag above a building. A forecast could become a newspaper line. An observer's measurements could become a warning that one person repeated to another. And this is probably how forecasting mattered most to many ordinary rural families. Not as a private message arriving directly from a government meteorologist, but through chains of people. Someone in town heard the forecast. The storekeeper mentioned it. A railroad employee carried the news. A neighbour returning home repeated it. Information radiated outward from the places connected to the wire. But every link required time. That was especially dangerous in a region where conditions could transform rapidly. During the January 1888 event, the Black Hills record shows falling temperatures, strong northerly winds, disrupted railroads, failed telegraph communication, and increasingly severe cold. In Rapid City, temperatures continued dropping after the initial storm, reaching well below zero during the following hours. This exposes the difference between a forecast and a warning system. A forecast says something dangerous may happen. A warning system gets that information to the person who must make a decision before the danger begins. The Great Plains of the late 19th century were beginning to possess the first part. They did not yet possess the second in anything like universal form. So settlers continued to live between two worlds. One world was modernizing quickly. Telegraph offices, railroad networks, synchronized observations, government forecasts, signal flags. The other world was still intensely local. A mother looking at the northern sky, a teacher deciding whether to dismiss school, a farmer checking the wind at the barn door, a traveller wondering whether the next settlement was close enough to risk reaching. Survival depended on combining both. Official information could provide an advantage when it arrived in time. Local judgment still decided what to do with it. Preparation still mattered, because even a perfect warning could not create fuel, food, shelter, or winter clothing after the storm began. And this is where the history becomes even more interesting. Because settlers were not simply passive recipients waiting for professional meteorology to save them. Long before forecasts became reliable and widely distributed, they had built their own informal weather system out of neighbours, memory, clouds, wind, animals, seasons, and repeated experience. Some of those signs were genuinely useful. Some were unreliable, and some became frontier folklore that sounded far more certain than the weather ever was. The useful signs were usually the ones closest to the weather itself. Wind was one of them. A settler did not need to understand frontal meteorology to notice that a mild wind had suddenly changed direction and begun arriving from the north or northwest. Modern meteorology explains why that mattered. The passage of a cold front is commonly marked by a wind shift and a drop in temperature. On the plains, where there were few hills or forests to break the flow, that change could become obvious very quickly. But obvious did not mean early. By the time the wind had turned hard and cold, the dangerous air mass might already be arriving. A person could recognize the sign correctly and still have only minutes to act. That is the central weakness of local weather knowledge. It was best at telling you that something was changing. It was much worse at telling you exactly how severe the change would become, how long it would last, or whether a distant storm would pass north or directly over your claim. Clouds offered another clue. A thickening sky, lowering clouds, blowing snow on the horizon, or a sudden loss of distant visibility could tell experienced residents that conditions were worsening. The open plains made distant weather easier to see than it would have been in wooded country. You could sometimes watch a dark line approach across miles of nearly uninterrupted horizon. Yet the same openness created false confidence. A storm that could be seen coming looked as if it could be measured by eye. A farmer might look toward the horizon, judge that the barn was close, and decide there was still time to finish one more task. A teacher might see worsening weather and think the children had enough time to reach home. The problem was that the visual signal did not reveal the speed at which visibility would collapse once wind began lifting loose snow from the ground. This mattered because a plains blizzard did not require fresh snow to create whiteout conditions. Strong wind could pick up snow already lying on the prairie and turn it into blowing snow. Modern National Weather Service definitions still recognize this distinction. A ground blizzard can develop from existing snow when strong wind reduces visibility, even with little or no new snowfall. That was especially deceptive after a period of calmer weather. The sky might not look like a classic heavy snowstorm. There might be no dramatic curtain of falling flakes. Then the wind increased, and yesterday's snow became today's emergency. Temperature was another sign, but it could be misleading in the opposite direction. The January 1888 storm became notorious partly because the day began comparatively mild. People adjusted their behaviour to what they were feeling at that moment. Children went to school without the heaviest clothing they might have worn during an obviously bitter morning. Farmers worked outside. Travellers started journeys. Then the cold arrived. The mistake was not that people were incapable of recognising cold weather. It was that present conditions encouraged decisions about the next several hours. That is a habit humans still have. What you feel now is easy to believe. What is approaching from hundreds of miles away is harder to imagine. A household with a barometer had one more piece of evidence. Falling atmospheric pressure can accompany an approaching low-pressure system, and older weather manuals treated a rapid fall in the barometer as a warning of stronger wind or an approaching disturbance. The instrument could therefore give information that the eye could not. But a barometer was not a private forecasting service. It did not tell a family that school should close at noon or that a specific cold wave would reach the farm at 3. It also did nothing for the household that did not own one. This is where folklore entered the gap. People everywhere developed sayings about weather. Animals behave differently. Smoke moves strangely. The moon looks unusual. A ring appears around it. Birds fly low. Cattle gather. An ache in a joint is said to predict a storm. Some sayings preserve observations that can have a physical connection to changing humidity, pressure, cloud type, or wind. Others work only occasionally. Some survive because people remember the times they appeared to be right. Even the later US Weather Bureau devoted formal study to weather folklore and local signs rather than simply treating all of it as one category. The important thing is not to mock them. For a family without immediate access to instruments or official forecasts, any repeated pattern could feel worth remembering. If the weather governed whether you planted, travelled, cut hay, sent children to school or moved cattle, then watching the environment closely was rational. The mistake comes later, when folklore is retold as if settlers possessed a secret forecasting system that modern people have forgotten. They did not. Their strongest advantage was accumulated local experience. A person who had spent 10 winters in one district knew where drifts usually formed, which direction brought the most punishing cold, how quickly a road disappeared, which buildings stayed warmest, and what kind of weather made livestock difficult to manage. That knowledge could be extremely valuable without being supernatural. And it was often knowledge about consequences rather than prediction. You might not know whether tonight's wind would become a major blizzard, but you knew that if the north wind strengthened while loose snow covered the ground, the road to town could become hard to follow. You knew that an animal left in the wrong pasture might drift with the storm. You knew that a child likely dressed for a mild afternoon could be in trouble if temperatures fell sharply before dismissal. That kind of reasoning is much less romantic than reading the sky. It is also much closer to how people actually survive uncertain environments. They notice recurring relationships. They remember previous failures. They lower risk before they have complete information. And the most experienced residents understood something that weather folklore sometimes hides. Signs could contradict one another. A mild morning could arrive before a severe cold wave. Clearer sky in one direction did not guarantee safe travel. A familiar winter pattern could suddenly behave differently. The records from January 1888 make that brutally clear. Nebraska historical accounts emphasize the unexpected arrival of the storm on a relatively warm day, the timing while children were in school and adults were working, and the rapid loss of visibility. Those were precisely the conditions under which local judgment had the least room for error. So the settlers who survived repeatedly were not necessarily the people who believed they could predict the prairie perfectly. They were often the people who organized their lives around the possibility that they could be wrong. That meant spare fuel, extra food, a known route between buildings, winter clothing carried when the morning did not seem to require it, and, increasingly, attention to official warnings whenever those warnings could be obtained. By the 1880s, even cattlemen around North Platte had become interested in cold wave warnings, because sudden temperature drops were not only a household danger, they were a business danger. A major storm could kill animals across enormous areas and wipe out months or years of investment. That would eventually pull weather forecasting into something larger than personal survival. It became part of the economics of the Great Plains. Because a winter storm could destroy something more expensive than a day's work. It could destroy the herd. That risk was especially visible on the northern plains in the winter of 1886 and 1887, one of the disasters that helped change western ranching. In western Dakota and across parts of the northern range, cattle had spent the warm months grazing on open grassland. The system was attractive because it kept winter costs low. Large operators did not necessarily plan to feed every animal hay through the cold season. Cattle were expected to find cured grass on the range and use natural shelter in river bottoms, coulees, draws, and broken country. In an ordinary winter, that could work. The winter of 1886 to 87 showed what happened when several ordinary assumptions failed at once. The preceding growing season had been dry in important parts of the northern range. Grass was poor, and many animals entered winter in weaker condition. Snow arrived early. Thaws and refreezing could put a hard crust over the forage below. Then repeated periods of severe cold and blizzard conditions made movement and grazing even more difficult. In western North Dakota, historical summaries describe cattle facing deep snow, ice-crusted grass, intense cold, and inadequate protection. The problem was not simply that the air was cold. A cow could survive a great deal of cold if it could keep eating. Food supplied the energy needed to maintain body temperature. But when snow and ice blocked access to grass, the animal had to spend more energy searching for less food. Wind increased heat loss. Weak animals became weaker. A herd that looked like wealth in autumn could become a collection of animals slowly consuming their own reserves. Theodore Roosevelt learned that lesson on a large scale. Before he became president, Roosevelt invested heavily in cattle in the Dakota Badlands. His Elkhorn Ranch and other interests made him part of the cattle boom of the 1880s. The National Park Service records that the terrible winter of 1886 to 87 killed nearly 80% of the cattle in the Badlands, and that Roosevelt lost more than half of his own herd. He was not alone. Across the northern plains, the winter struck an industry already carrying too many cattle in some areas. The National Park Service estimates that roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the cattle on the northern plains were lost during the hard winter, although local losses varied greatly. Some operators survived financially, others did not. The important change came afterward. The catastrophe weakened confidence in the idea that cattle could simply be placed on open range and expected to take care of themselves through almost any winter. At Grant Corps Ranch in Montana, National Park Service history describes ranchers increasingly feeding hay through winter after the hard season of 1886 to 87. It sounds like an obvious solution, but hay required land, labour, equipment, cutting, stacking and planning months before the first blizzard. That is the same survival principle we have already seen at the household scale, now expanded to an entire livestock economy. Winter survival was summer work. A rancher who wanted hay available in January had to think about it in June and July. Grass had to be cut when it was ready, cured well enough to store, hauled and stacked where it could later be used. The quantity mattered. A few animals beside a homestead were one problem. Hundreds or thousands of cattle were another. Feeding a large herd day after day transformed cheap open-range ranching into something more expensive and controlled. Shelter also became easier to think about once the cost of having none had been demonstrated. Western Dakota's broken badlands offered draws and gullies where cattle could get out of the strongest wind, but natural shelter was unevenly distributed, and animals did not always remain where a rancher wanted them. During storms, cattle could drift with the wind. Fences, river bends, rough ground, and other obstacles could influence where they accumulated. A rancher who had spent summer thinking mainly about grass suddenly had to think about where the herd would be during a northerly gale in January. This was one reason the shift away from the pure open-range model mattered. Barbed wire, fenced claims, hay production, better winter management, and smaller or more controllable herds did not make blizzards harmless. They changed the number of things that could be decided before the storm arrived. A fence could create problems of its own, but it could also define where animals were supposed to be. Stored feed reduced dependence on buried grass. A barn, shed, windbreak, coulee, or protected yard could reduce exposure for selected animals. And settlers with only a few animals faced the same decisions in miniature. A family milk cow might matter more to daily survival than a distant cattleman's entire percentage calculation. Milk could be part of the household diet. A team of horses represented transport and farm power. Chickens, pigs, and cattle converted stored grain and feed into food, labour, and cash. Protecting those animals was therefore not sentimental. It was part of keeping the household functioning. That changed the design of work around a homestead. Feed needed to be close enough to reach. Barn doors needed to function after drifting snow. Water had to remain obtainable. A path used every day in good weather might need a more dependable reference in bad weather. The animals most valuable to the family might be kept nearer the house during threatening conditions. None of this required knowing the exact forecast. It required accepting that the forecast might fail to reach you, or that the storm might be worse than expected. That distinction is important. Great Plains settlers did not survive by defeating uncertainty. They survived, when they did, by reducing the number of things that uncertainty could take away at once. The hard winter of 1886 to 87 pushed ranching toward that logic. One storm season had exposed the weakness of an economic model built around low winter inputs and abundant open grass. Afterward, more ranchers had reason to treat hay, controlled grazing, and winter protection not as optional expenses, but as insurance against a landscape that could suddenly stop providing free feed. Yet even the best prepared farm still had one resource that could not simply be stacked in advance: water. In severe cold, wells froze, pumps failed, snow had to be melted, and livestock still needed to drink. A household could have food, fuel, and shelter, and discover that the next winter problem was sitting only a few steps outside the kitchen door. Water was ordinary until it stopped being easy to reach. On a Great Plains homestead, the source might be a well, a spring, a creek, or another nearby supply, and the quality of a claim could depend heavily on whether usable water was available. The National Park Service still uses access to water as one of the basic factors when explaining why some homestead claims were more workable than others. A family could tolerate an inconvenient walk in calm weather. A blizzard changed the meaning of every yard between the kitchen and the pump. That was why one of the quietest forms of storm preparation was simply carrying water indoors before conditions became bad. A later Nebraska pioneer recollection describes exactly that pattern. The writer remembered an approaching blizzard in southwest Nebraska, parents arriving to collect children from school, livestock being sheltered, and the family carrying in both wood and water before the storm closed around them. The detail is small, but it shows how experienced households thought. They were not only asking whether the house was warm now, they were asking which outside chores would become difficult after visibility disappeared. Water was one of the first. A hand pump could be close to the house and still require someone to dress, open a door, clear snow, operate the mechanism, fill buckets, and carry them back without spilling much. If snow drifted around the well, or the exposed parts of the pump froze, a familiar chore became slower. If the family drew water from a source farther away, the problem grew larger. Then there were the animals. North Dakota's historical materials on pioneer farming make adequate water, feed, and shelter part of the basic work of keeping horses, cattle, and other livestock healthy. A household might be able to reduce its own water use for a short period. A barn full of animals created a much larger daily requirement. Horses doing farm work were especially valuable, while a milk cow supplied food directly to the household. Watering them was not a task that could simply be forgotten until spring. This helps explain why settlers invested so much effort in wells and later wind-powered pumping. At Homestead National Historical Park, interpretation of homestead life notes that windmills were pumping water for livestock by the early 20th century and made daily life easier. A windmill did not eliminate winter. It reduced some of the repeated labor required to lift water when the system was working. But every water system had a final distance. The trough might be outside. The bucket still had to be carried. Ice could form where water stood exposed. Snow could block access. Livestock could be sheltered on one side of the property while the well was on another. As with fuel, the decisive question during a blizzard was not whether the farm technically possessed water. It was whether water could be moved safely from where it existed to where it was needed. If that failed, snow offered an emergency supply. There is a useful Nebraska document from Christmas 1870. A cattleman following roughly 1,200 cattle wrote to his sister after being caught in winter conditions. He reported frozen ears and hands and said that he and his companions had been forced to obtain water by melting snow before reaching a station where they could water their horses and get more food. Melting snow sounds simple because the raw material is everywhere. It is also inefficient. Loose snow contains a great deal of air. A pot packed with it settles into a much smaller amount of liquid water. More snow must be added, then more again. Heat that might otherwise warm the room is used to melt it. A household with limited fuel therefore faced an unpleasant trade. Snow could replace inaccessible water, but converting it into water consumed another supply that winter had made precious. Still, that trade was better than having no water at all. And it reveals why storm preparation usually consisted of several connected choices rather than one clever trick. Carrying water inside reduced the need to burn fuel melting snow. Storing fuel nearby reduced the need to cross the yard. Sheltering animals reduced the distance required to care for them. Food already in the house reduced travel. Each preparation removed one reason to open the door later. The arrangement of a homestead therefore mattered almost as much as the inventory inside it. Early claims developed over time. A family might begin with a dugout or sod house, then add a barn, well, sheds, fencing, planted trees, and eventually a frame house. These buildings were not placed according to a modern emergency plan. They were shaped by terrain, money, labour, access to water, prevailing winds, and the order in which the family could afford to build them. A severe winter exposed every inconvenient part of that arrangement. If the well sat on the wrong side of a large drift, someone had to solve that problem. If a barn door opened into the direction where snow accumulated, it might need digging out. If the fuel pile was separated from the house, the family learned exactly how far away it felt in a whiteout. If livestock water froze repeatedly, the same chore returned again and again. This is also why the simple phrase, "they stayed inside," can be misleading. People tried to stay inside because going outside was dangerous, but a homestead was a working system spread across several structures. Animals, water, fuel, food stores, tools, and people were not necessarily under one roof. Surviving a long storm meant shrinking that system as much as possible before the weather made movement difficult. Bring in what could be brought in. Put vulnerable animals where they could be reached. Fill containers. Feed the stove. Then reduce the number of trips. This was not foresight in the modern forecasting sense. It was contingency. A family did not need to know that the wind would reach a certain speed at a certain hour. They only needed enough warning from experience, neighbours, an official bulletin, or the sky to decide that doing extra chores now was cheaper than doing them later. And sometimes that warning never came. Then the household discovered its weaknesses while the storm was already operating. An empty bucket, a buried path, a frozen latch, a horse that still needed water. At that point, survival depended less on predicting weather than on preserving the ability to work inside it. Because the next resource a settler could lose was not stored in a barrel, stacked beside a stove, or pumped from the ground. It was the use of fingers, feet, and judgment in the cold. Once those began to fail, almost every other survival method became harder. A person could know exactly where the house stood and still be unable to reach it if the feet no longer worked properly. A farmer could arrive at a barn and discover that stiff fingers could not manage a frozen latch. Someone who had spent an hour fighting wind and snow might continue walking even after the cold had begun to affect concentration. Modern medicine separates several cold ingredients, but 19th century settlers experienced them without neat categories. They knew numb hands, frozen feet, confused travellers, and people who looked safe after being brought indoors but were far more injured than anyone first realised. Frostbite was the visible danger. The body protects its core in severe cold partly by reducing blood flow to exposed extremities. Fingers, toes, ears, and the nose become especially vulnerable. Numbness is deceptive because pain can lessen as damage becomes worse. A person who still feels an aching hand knows there is a problem. A person who can no longer feel the hand may be in more trouble, not less. Modern National Weather Service guidance still lists loss of feeling and pale skin among the warning signs of frostbite. The less visible danger was what we would now call hypothermia. As the body cools, shivering, exhaustion, poor coordination, confusion and disorientation can appear. That matters enormously in a blizzard because survival already depends on navigation and judgment. The storm does not need to make a person unconscious. It only needs to make the next decision worse. A traveller who should stop might keep walking. Someone near shelter might fail to recognize it. A person trying to help another could become slow, clumsy, and less able to solve simple problems. Clothing therefore bought time. There was no single pioneer winter outfit. What people wore depended on money, age, occupation, what the household could make, and what had survived years of use. But surviving accounts show the practical vocabulary of cold weather dress: heavy coats, woolen layers, hoods, scarves, mittens, boots, overshoes, blankets, and wraps. One Nebraska schoolchild later remembered what she wore on the morning of January 12, 1888. Her coat had been made from her father's blue army blanket. She wore a hand-quilted hood, a scarf wrapped around her neck, and boots. The description is useful because it is not a clothing advertisement or a later costume reconstruction. It is a remembered set of ordinary things a rural family assembled for a child going to school. The same account also shows how much chance mattered. The morning had been mild enough that winter clothing could feel excessive, yet that child's mother insisted on the boots. By 2 in the afternoon, the blizzard had struck the schoolhouse so hard that snow was being driven through cracks in the building. Whatever had seemed unnecessarily heavy in the morning had acquired a completely different value by afternoon. This was one of the cruel features of the Schoolchildren's blizzard. The relatively warm air before the front encouraged people to venture out without the protection they would have chosen on an obviously bitter morning. The National Weather Service still highlights that sequence when explaining the 1888 ground blizzard. Mild conditions lowered people's guard before temperatures fell rapidly and strong winds turned loose snow into near whiteout conditions. A heavy coat helped, but it did not make long exposure safe. Wind could work through openings around the neck, sleeves, buttons, and seams. Snow caught in clothing could melt from body heat and add moisture. Mittens were valuable because keeping fingers together generally conserved warmth better than separating them, but hands still had to emerge for tasks requiring dexterity. Boots could become packed with snow. Clothing that worked during a short walk could become inadequate after an hour of wandering. The practical goal was not elegance. It was to keep a layer of warmer air around the body and keep wind and moisture from removing that warmth too quickly. A later visitor gives us a useful comparison. In January 1895, journalist Nellie Bly travelled through drought-stricken Nebraska and South Dakota during deep winter. She was not a homesteader, and her clothing was better than what many poor families she interviewed could afford. Yet even heavily bundled, she found the cold punishing. On one trip, she wore a sealskin coat, a cape, overshoes, mittens, a woolen hood, and several rugs wrapped around her. She still became so cold that her driver had to help her from the wagon when they stopped at a small dugout to warm themselves. That account is useful because it corrects another easy assumption. More clothing did not erase the environment. It extended the margin. That margin might be enough for a half-mile trip that would otherwise be fatal. It might keep hands functional long enough to find a door. It might allow a child to sit through a cold night in a schoolhouse without developing the same injuries as someone who had left lightly dressed. But clothing could not turn several hours in a violent plains blizzard into an ordinary walk. Dryness mattered too. Inside a crowded schoolhouse or farmhouse, snow brought in on coats and boots melted. Garments worn during heavy work could become damp from perspiration. If someone then went outside again, that moisture increased the problem. Families did not need modern fabric science to know that dry mittens were better than wet ones, or that clothing should be warmed and dried when possible. And clothing was not equally available. This is where economic survival and physical survival overlapped. A prosperous rancher, town merchant, or railroad employee might own better coats, boots, gloves, blankets, and replacement garments. A struggling homesteader could be wearing patched clothing because there was nothing else. Nellie Bly's 1895 reporting from drought-stricken Nebraska described families so poor that adequate shoes and clothing had become part of the relief problem. For those households, dress warmly was not a simple instruction. Winter clothing represented wool, leather, sewing, money, time, and the ability to replace what children outgrew or adults wore through. This made small household decisions surprisingly important. An old army blanket could become a child's coat. A scarf could close the gap around a neck. Overshoes could protect ordinary footwear. Extra wraps could be placed in a wagon. Dry mittens could be kept near the stove. The family's winter defences were often assembled from ordinary objects rather than specialised equipment. And once someone came back inside, the danger was not always over. Records from the 1888 blizzard include survivors whose cold injuries eventually required amputations, showing that reaching shelter did not always end the medical consequences of exposure. That changed the meaning of preparation again. The best treatment was not to need rescue. The best coat was the one worn before the temperature fell. and the safest mile was often the mile you decided not to walk. That sounds like a personal rule, but after enough storms it became a community lesson. The one-room schoolhouse was where that lesson became most visible. Rural schools were scattered across the plains because children lived on widely separated farms. A single teacher might be responsible for many ages in one room, while also managing the basic winter routine of the building. When the weather changed suddenly, that teacher became the person who had to decide whether many separate families would be safer if their children stayed together or tried to reach many separate homes. The blizzard of January 12, 1888 made the consequences unforgettable. Because so many children were already at school when the storm struck, the event became known as the Schoolchildren's or Children's Blizzard. History Nebraska preserves accounts of teachers who chose differently under different circumstances. Minnie Freeman led 13 pupils toward a farmhouse, while Lois Royce attempted to reach shelter with 3 children and suffered devastating frostbite after the children died. Emma Shattuck became stranded and survived for days in a haystack before later dying from complications of her injuries. There was no lesson in those stories as simple as never leave the school. A building could fail, fuel could run low, the nearest farmhouse might be extremely close. A child's home might be visible when the decision was made, and invisible 5 minutes later. What the storm demonstrated was that dismissal itself was a risk decision. Sending children out because the normal school day had ended could be more dangerous than keeping them overnight. Waiting for parents or for the weather to improve might feel inconvenient, but inconvenience had to be compared with exposure. The storm became notorious precisely because it arrived when children were in school and farmers were working. While blowing snow reduced visibility to almost nothing, that distinction seems obvious only after the disaster. Beforehand, school was part of routine. Children walked or rode familiar routes every day. A mile did not feel like wilderness. A teacher who had released pupils hundreds of times without trouble could easily believe that home remained the safest destination. The storm transformed a familiar road into terrain where direction could disappear. Afterward, survivors remembered exactly which choices had worked. History Nebraska's collection of 1888 survivor accounts shows how deeply the storm remained in public memory more than half a century later. Survivors gathered in Lincoln and formed the January 12, 1888 Blizzard Club. One of the club's main purposes was to collect memories of the storm, eventually producing a book from those accounts. That tells us something important about how frontier knowledge was transmitted. It did not live only in official manuals. It lived in repeated stories about the neighbour who stayed, the teacher who moved, the route that failed, and the child who had been dressed properly, despite a mild morning. A severe storm, therefore, created an informal map of safe and unsafe behaviour. This family had a cellar. That neighbour's barn was stronger. The school had enough fuel for a night. The creek crossing drifted badly. The north road disappeared first. A row of cottonwoods could be followed when fences vanished. That last example comes directly from one 1888 survivor. Ellen Rennerfeld remembered walking home from school with her teacher while following a row of cottonwoods that extended much of the way toward her family's house. Several other schoolchildren then remained at that house for days because their parents could not immediately reach them. These were local facts. They could not be printed as one universal Great Plains survival code because every settlement was different. But within a community they could become extremely valuable. A new family might need several winters to learn which road became impassable. An older neighbour already knew. The same logic applied to communication. Official weather warnings were improving, but their final delivery could still depend on fragile infrastructure and people. A warning reaching a telegraph office was not automatically a warning reaching every farm. The 1888 storm demonstrated that weakness clearly in the Black Hills, where the Western Union telegraph line went down and prevented the cold wave warning issued from St. Paul from reaching Rapid City on time. The forecast existed. The communication path failed. The atmosphere did not wait for repairs. Rail transportation was disrupted at the same time. Snow packed into railroad cuts so densely that trains could not continue through some sections. further isolating communities. Yet telephone service between some Black Hills towns remained operational, providing another route for information. The contrast shows why redundancy mattered even before people commonly used that word. You watched the sky, but you also listened to the forecast. You knew the road, but you also knew the fence line. You expected children home, but you knew which neighbours might shelter them. You stored food, but you also maintained relationships with people who could help if the household ran short. That last part is easy to underestimate. Frontier mythology often celebrates the isolated settler conquering the plains alone. Actual winter survival repeatedly exposes the weakness of that image. Severe weather created problems one household could not always solve. Search parties required people. A badly frostbitten survivor needed help. Children unable to reach home stayed with other families until travel became possible. Victims of the 1888 storm even became the beneficiaries of relief funds raised for injured teachers, pupils, and other sufferers. A good relationship with neighbours therefore functioned almost like another emergency supply. Not because everyone lived in perfect harmony. Rural communities had disagreements, debts, rivalries, and grudges like any other place. But a blizzard could temporarily make cooperation more valuable than independence. The nearest person with a strong team, a warm building, extra fuel, or knowledge of a missing traveller might suddenly matter more than anyone else in the county. Distance complicated that cooperation. A nearby neighbour was not necessarily next door. Farms could be separated by significant stretches of open ground. That meant checking on someone was itself a risk decision. The desire to help could not automatically justify leaving shelter during the worst part of the storm. Sometimes the safest help was delayed help. Timing mattered again. Before the storm, warn. During the storm, shelter. After the storm, search. That sequence was never absolute, but it captures the logic settlers gradually built from experience. The earlier a danger could be acted upon, the safer the action usually became. Moving animals before the wind rose was better than rescuing them later. Bringing children home before visibility failed was better than searching for them afterward. Carrying water and fuel inside was better than crossing the yard when the path had vanished. Putting on heavy clothing before leaving was better than wishing for it halfway home. The real achievement was not learning how to perform heroic rescues. It was learning how to reduce the number of rescues that would ever be necessary. And this gradual accumulation of local rules was happening while the national forecasting system was expanding around them. The plains were being tied together through railroads, telegraph lines, weather stations, newspapers, and new communications networks. Yet the 1888 storm proved that even modern infrastructure could fail during the exact weather it was supposed to warn people about. So the older survival system did not simply disappear. Memory remained useful. Neighbours remained useful. Landmarks remained useful. Preparation remained useful. Official forecasts were added on top of those things rather than instantly replacing them. That combination was increasingly powerful, but it still left one enormous physical problem. Even if a family knew a blizzard was coming, the house had to withstand it. During the 1888 storm, Mrs. T. C. Porter of Nebraska remembered her house rocking in the wind while plaster cracked upstairs. She and her children were sheltered, but shelter itself was being tested around them. And on a nearly treeless plain, the difference between a structure that merely stood there and one that actually protected human beings could be measured in walls, roofs, cracks, snowdrifts, and the direction of the wind. The first defence was often made from the prairie itself. Across large parts of the Great Plains, timber was scarce enough that a newly arrived family could not simply cut logs and build the sort of cabin associated with older, wooded frontiers. Nebraska historians noted that even a sod house or dugout still required some wood for roof supports, doors, and windows, but the bulk of the walls could come directly from the ground. Settlers cut the tough, root-bound prairie turf into blocks and stacked it much like heavy masonry. That choice was partly economic. A homesteader needed cash for tools, seed, animals, filing fees, and food while the first crops were being established. Lumber hauled long distances could be expensive. Sod was already underfoot. National Register documentation for western South Dakota describes sod construction as inexpensive enough that the main purchase materials might be windows, doors, and, if used, wooden shingles. Thick sod walls were also remembered as warm in winter and cool in summer. For winter survival, the thickness mattered because the wall did two jobs at once. It slowed the transfer of heat, and it stopped moving air far better than a badly fitted board wall full of cracks. The small stove did not have to compete with the full force of every gust outside. A room could remain uncomfortable and still be dramatically safer than open prairie. The difference did not need to be luxurious. It only needed to keep the indoor temperature far enough above the outdoor one that people could sleep, eat, dry clothing, and keep their hands useful. A dugout pushed the same idea farther. Instead of raising the entire room above the prairie, settlers could excavate into a slope or bank and let the earth form part of the enclosure. Historic American Building Survey material on Great Plains dugouts describes them as cheap to build, naturally cool in summer, and relatively good at retaining heat in winter. For a family with very little money, that could make a dugout an efficient first shelter. Some builders reduced exposure before the walls were even finished. Nebraska research describes houses built partly below grade to lower the amount of wall that had to be raised above the prairie. That saved material and placed more of the room against earth rather than moving air. It did not make the dwelling dry or elegant. And a badly chosen low site could create drainage trouble. But in cold weather, the basic advantage was clear. Less surface was directly facing the wind. But neither form was a perfect winter bunker. The weak point was often overhead. Roofs still needed structure. Nebraska research on prairie housing notes that even earth-built dwellings required ridgepoles and stringers to carry the roof. Sod or earth laid over that framework added weight. Rain created a different problem. Water could soak the roof, increase its weight, drip into the room, and in bad cases, contribute to collapse. Historic accounts are full of pans, buckets, cloth ceilings, and other attempts to manage dirt and water coming down from above. That mattered in winter because a shelter was only as reliable as its weakest part. A family might have walls nearly immune to ordinary wind while worrying about the roof, a stovepipe opening, a door, or a small window. Drifting snow could also change access to the building, piling deeply on one side while exposed ground remained elsewhere. The storm turned construction details that were mildly annoying in October into practical questions in January. Severe plain storms left buildings partly buried by packed drifts in surviving accounts and photographs. Could the door still open? Was the roof carrying more weight than usual? Could someone reach the fuel without digging through a drift? Would wind enter around the window frame? The answer depended on workmanship, maintenance, and money. This is one reason the phrase sod house hides enormous variation. Some were rough temporary shelters with dirt floors and simple roofs. Others acquired wooden floors, plastered interior walls, better doors, framed windows, and improved roofs as families gained resources. Library of Congress documentation of surviving examples shows builders mixing sod with purchased materials whenever they could. The house was not a fixed frontier type. It could evolve with the household. That evolution also followed the railroad. As transportation networks expanded, milled lumber, shingles, hardware, and other manufactured building materials became easier to obtain in many districts. National Register surveys from the Northern Plains describe wood frame construction becoming more common as railroad access improved. Families who had begun in a dugout or soddy often wanted a frame house when they could afford one. That was not simply because wood was warmer. In fact, a poorly built frame house could be drafty. What lumber offered was a different package of advantages: cleaner interiors, easier expansion, conventional windows and floors, and freedom from some of the moisture and maintenance problems of earth roofs and walls. The frontier housing story was therefore not a straight march from a bad cold house to a good warm one. It was a trade between cost, availability, comfort, durability, and weather resistance. Even a solid house could still behave badly in a blizzard. Wind pressure found openings. Fine snow could enter through small gaps. Doors on the exposed side of a building might become difficult to use. Drifts formed according to the shape of the structure and the direction of the wind, which meant one side of a house could be swept nearly clear while another disappeared behind packed snow. Historical Nebraska accounts describe snow being driven into pioneer buildings and drifts covering structures during major storms. Experienced families learned their own building the way they learned their land. They knew which window leaked. They knew where the snow normally piled. They knew which door might have to be cleared first. They knew whether the stove could keep the main room warm with everyone gathered there rather than trying to heat every corner of the house. That knowledge made winter living more efficient because the household could contract around the safest room. Beds, chairs, food preparation, wet clothing, and children could all move closer to the source of heat when necessary. A one-room sod house did this automatically. A larger frame home offered more space in ordinary life but could demand more fuel if people tried to keep all of it equally warm. The house therefore became a small climate that had to be managed. Heat was produced in one place. Cold entered at particular points. People adjusted themselves between the two, and this is why settlers paid attention not only to the material of a house, but eventually to what stood around it. A building alone on open prairie received the wind directly. A building near a rise grove, planted row of trees, or other obstruction experienced the same storm differently. On a landscape where natural timber could be rare, changing that exposure required years rather than hours. The next layer of blizzard protection was something a new settler could not build in a weekend. It had to grow. And that meant tree protection was one of the strangest forms of blizzard preparation on the Great Plains, because the family doing the work might wait years before receiving the full benefit. Newcomers from wetter eastern states often arrived in landscapes where extensive forests were absent, that created obvious shortages of lumber and firewood. But it also meant farmsteads could stand almost completely exposed to wind. Contemporary settlement policy treated this treelessness as a problem to be changed, and in 1873 Congress passed the Timber Culture Act to encourage tree planting on western prairie lands. The original law offered another quarter section, up to 160 acres, to people who met substantial tree planting requirements. The rules were changed several times, eventually requiring 10 planted acres rather than the original 40. On a 10-acre planting, regulations could demand thousands of trees per acre, with a required number still alive when the claimant made final proof. On paper, it sounded like a straightforward exchange. Plant trees. Receive land. On the plains. Planting the tree was sometimes the easy part. Keeping it alive was harder. Young trees faced drought, grass competition, insects, fire, grazing animals, and strong wind. The North Dakota historical record emphasizes that many claimants struggled because rainfall could not be relied upon, and the labor and expense of maintaining enormous numbers of seedlings were substantial. So the federal program did not magically cover the plains in mature forest. History Nebraska describes the Timber Culture Act as both heavily abused and largely unsuccessful. Millions of Nebraska acres were entered as timber claims, but final proof was completed on a much smaller portion, and the law was eventually repealed in 1891. Yet the trees that did survive taught farmers something extremely practical. They changed the wind. You did not need a forest. Even a belt or grove could interrupt air moving directly across the property. By around 1900, North Dakota historical materials note that farmers understood that trees could slow wind across farms and trap blowing snow, creating drifts that later contributed moisture when they melted. For a winter household, that was not an abstract agricultural benefit. Wind determined where snow accumulated, put an obstacle in moving air, and the pattern of drifting changed. That could be useful. It could also create a new problem. A poorly placed barrier might encourage snow to accumulate when nobody wanted it. A road, gate, barn entrance, or house could end up near the drift, so planting trees was not simply a matter of making the farm less windy. What mattered was understanding that windbreaks reshaped airflow and therefore reshaped snow. This is where the Great Plains settlers' mental map became more sophisticated. The landscape was no longer something you merely occupied. You could modify it. A barn wall modified wind. A fence modified drifting snow. A grove modified both. A planted row could make one patch of ground calmer while creating accumulation somewhere farther downwind. And unlike carrying fuel indoors, this was slow engineering. The first winter after planting a row of seedlings offered almost nothing. Years later, the same planting could be tall enough to matter. That long delay helps explain why trees around older farmsteads became valuable beyond the original land law requirements. A successful grove could supply shade in summer, some wood, protection from prevailing winds, and a more sheltered zone around buildings or livestock. Historical discussion of tree culture on the plains increasingly emphasized protection from strong winds as practical knowledge accumulated. Imagine arriving at a nearly bare claim. At first, the house receives everything directly. Summer wind, winter wind, dust, blowing snow. There is almost no intermediate layer between the building and the atmosphere. Then the family plants. The first year, there are sticks. The next year, some die, others are replaced. Grass has to be controlled around them. Animals have to be kept out. Dry years take more. A decade later, if enough have survived, the homestead no longer interacts with the wind in quite the same way. That change is easy to miss because no single winter produces it. But frontier adaptation often worked like this. One disaster taught a lesson. The family changed a small part of the farm. Another winter tested it. Neighbours noticed what worked. Practices spread. Not every innovation came from government meteorologists or agricultural scientists. Some came from looking at where snow consistently accumulated and asking why. And trees were not the only barriers settlers could use. Fences, barns, sheds, haystacks, terrain, creek banks, railroad cuts, and even snow itself altered wind near the ground. A person walking during a blizzard might use those objects as guides. A farmer planning a farmstead could learn which side of a structure accumulated the deepest drift. The key was predictability. A settler could not control where the storm originated, but the drift beside the barn tended to form for a reason. If the dominant winter winds repeatedly came from similar directions, then the same obstacles repeatedly influenced the snow. That knowledge could be used. Doors could be placed or protected differently. Feed could be stored on the more accessible side. Routes between buildings could follow features less likely to disappear completely. Trees could be planted where their influence was useful rather than merely picturesque. This was weather preparation without forecasting. Instead of predicting the atmosphere, settlers altered the consequences after the atmosphere arrived. The distinction matters. A forecast might give you 6 hours. A windbreak took years. But once mature, the windbreak did not need a telegram. It simply stood there. The larger government shelter belt programs most people now associate with the Great Plains came much later, especially during the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s. Those massive projects should not be projected backward onto 19th century homesteaders, but they expanded an idea plains farmers had already encountered on a smaller scale. Tree belts could be deliberately used to reduce wind exposure across agricultural land. For 19th century settlers, the result was more modest and personal. A few rows, a grove near the house, trees surviving on a timber claim, something between the north wind and the kitchen wall, and when snow arrived, that protection became visible. The wind slowed, snow fell out of the moving air, a drift formed. Behind the trees, conditions could feel different from the open prairie only a short distance away. that did not make travel safe in a major blizzard. It did something more useful. It made the immediate farmstead less exposed. By now, a pattern should be emerging. Settlers survived severe winters by building layers. The thick walls slowed heat loss. The stove replaced lost heat. Stored fuel kept the stove alive. Stored food removed the need to travel. Water inside removed another trip. Heavy clothing bought time. Outside, ropes, rails, fences and trees preserved orientation. Neighbours supplied redundancy. Weather reports added information. No single layer was enough. That mattered because the planes could defeat any one of them. A telegraph line could fall. A roof could fail. Fuel could run low. A horse could die. A traveller could lose the fence. A tree grove could be buried in drifting snow. Survival improved when failure of one thing did not immediately become failure of everything. And there was one more layer that settlers could not manufacture from sod, lumber, wool, or wire. They needed food that would remain edible when roads disappeared, stores were unreachable, and the storm lasted longer than expected. Because once a family had heat, water, and shelter, the next question became surprisingly basic. What could they actually eat until the prairie opened again? The safest answer was whatever did not require a trip to town. That sounds almost too simple, but it explains a great deal about winter life on the Great Plains. A homestead was not only a place where food was cooked, it was a small storage system designed around seasons. During the warm months, families tried to turn short-lived harvests into things that would still exist in January. Potatoes, carrots, beets, and other root vegetables could be stored in a cellar. North Dakota historical materials describe cellars as cool storage spaces beneath or beside the house, where vegetables could last through winter and dairy products could be kept for shorter periods. National Register documentation from Great Plains homesteads similarly identifies root cellars as important parts of a family's winter food supply. That meant the blizzard meal often began months earlier. Potatoes had to be planted, weeded, dug, sorted and stored before the ground froze. Grain had to be harvested, threshed, hauled, milled, or kept until it could be processed. Wheat, oats, corn and flax were among the major grains raised by pioneer farmers in North Dakota, with much of the wheat sent to mills for flour. Fruit might be preserved when available. Meat could be salted, smoked, dried, or otherwise kept according to the household's resources and traditions. The point was not variety, it was durability. A cellar helped because the earth moderated temperature. Inside, food was protected from some of the extreme swings occurring above ground. Root vegetables did not need to be kept warm like people, but they also could not simply freeze solid repeatedly without damage. The cellar created a middle environment, cool enough to slow spoilage, protected enough to keep food usable much longer than it would remain on a kitchen shelf. But the cellar had to remain reachable. That is where a blizzard again turned architecture into logistics. A cellar entered from inside the house was very different from a separate outdoor root cellar after several feet of drifting snow had accumulated. A family could possess a winter's worth of potatoes and still find the doorway buried. The same principle applied to a smokehouse, granary, or storage shed. Such structures were common elements of Great Plains farm and ranch properties. Supplies that existed somewhere on the property were only as useful as the route leading to them. So households tended to keep an immediate reserve close at hand. Flour mattered enormously because it was compact, familiar, and flexible. With flour, water, salt, fat, and heat, a family could make simple breads, biscuits, dumplings, or other filling foods without needing fresh ingredients. Cornmeal and other grains served similar purposes depending on region and family background. These were not emergency foods in the modern sense. They were ordinary staples whose storage qualities made them especially valuable when winter isolated a household. Then there was meat. A farm family might slaughter animals when cold weather made preservation easier, or smoking and salting offered longer storage. Historical Great Plains ranch and farm documentation regularly includes smokehouses, meat storage buildings, cellars, and granaries among the outbuildings associated with rural properties. The exact diet varied widely, but the infrastructure shows the underlying strategy. Food had to survive after harvest and slaughter because the household could not depend on buying everything fresh. Milk was different. If the family had a cow producing through part of the winter, milk could add fat, protein, and variety. Butter and cream could also be stored for limited periods in a cool cellar. But a milk cow created obligations. She had to be fed, watered, and milked whether the weather was convenient or not. Protecting the cow protected part of the family's diet. Chickens and pigs created similar trade-offs. They could provide food, but they still required feed and shelter. Cattle, poultry, garden crops, and stored grain were not separate categories in a pioneer household. They were one linked food economy. If the blizzard killed animals, blocked access to feed, or exhausted fuel, it could damage several parts of that system at once. The kitchen stove sat at the center of it. Fuel did not merely heat the room, it cooked food, heated water, thawed frozen items, and could help melt snow if the normal water supply became inaccessible. Running short of fuel, therefore, threatened more than comfort. It reduced the family's ability to turn stored ingredients into meals. That encouraged simple cooking. A family trapped indoors had little reason to waste fuel on elaborate preparation. Foods that could simmer in one pot, bake while the stove was already hot, or be reheated efficiently made sense. Broths, stews, porridges, bread, potatoes, beans, preserved meat and similar staples fit the economy of a winter household because they combined calories with practical cooking. Scarcity changed the calculation further. Not every Great Plains family entered winter with a full cellar. Crop failure, drought, debt, illness, or a bad harvest could leave a household with very little stored food. Nebraska records from 19th century drought crises describe families requiring outside relief for basic necessities, including food and clothing. In early 1895, Nellie Bly encountered Nebraska families suffering extreme food shortages after the disastrous drought and crop failures of 1894. That matters because the phrase, "settlers stored enough for winter," can sound more universal than reality. Some did. Some barely did. Some depended on neighbours, local stores, credit, or relief when their own reserves failed. A blizzard exposed that difference immediately. A prosperous household with sacks of flour, preserved meat, vegetables, feed, and fuel could treat several days of isolation as an inconvenience. A poor household might already be rationing before the first snowflake arrived. And because stores were concentrated in towns, rural isolation magnified the problem. A family could not simply decide to buy more food after roads disappeared. The food system therefore worked in layers, just like the rest of winter survival. First, what was already in the kitchen? Second, what could be reached elsewhere on the farm? Third, what neighbours could share? Fourth, what town could supply once travel resumed? The longer the storm and aftermath lasted, the farther down that chain a family moved. This is where cooperation became practical rather than sentimental. A neighbour with flour could matter as much as a neighbour with a strong team. A household sheltering stranded schoolchildren suddenly had extra mouths to feed. Someone recovering from frostbite might be unable to do normal chores. Shifting work and food needs onto relatives or nearby families. Community survival meant that food sometimes moved toward the people who could no longer reach it themselves. And the most successful winter preparations reduced how often that emergency exchange was necessary. A filled cellar, a sack of flour, potatoes below ground, preserved meat, feed for the cow, fuel beside the stove, water inside. None of those things predicted the next blizzard. They did something more dependable. They allowed the family to ignore it for a while. For several hours, perhaps several days, the world outside could disappear behind blowing snow, and the household could continue eating, drinking, heating, and waiting. That ability to wait was one of the greatest survival advantages settlers could create. Because once hunger stopped forcing movement, the family could make the safer decision again and again. Stay inside. But even a well-stocked household could eventually be trapped by something food could not solve. The storm might isolate them longer than expected. A roof might fail. Someone might become sick or injured. Or the family might realize that another person, somewhere beyond the white horizon, needed help more urgently than they needed to remain safe. And that is where the final decisions became the hardest of all. The hardest decision was deciding when helping someone else was worth becoming exposed yourself. On the Great Plains, that choice could arrive before anyone knew whether a person was actually in danger. A child had not returned from school. A husband had not come back from town. Someone had left for the barn and seemed to have been gone too long. The distance might be half a mile, perhaps less. Every instinct encouraged movement. Go find them. But during a full blizzard, searching could turn one missing person into two. The January 1888 storm demonstrated why. It struck while children were at school and adults were already working or travelling, and blowing snow reduced visibility nearly to zero for hours in affected areas. People who normally knew every road, fence, house and field around them could lose orientation almost immediately. So waiting could become an act of discipline. Imagine being a parent whose child should already be home. You cannot telephone the school. You cannot see farther than the yard. The teacher may have kept the children inside, or dismissed them. Your child may be sheltered with a neighbour, or walking somewhere in the storm. Every possibility produces a different correct response. The problem is that you do not know which one is true. Going toward the school might save the child. It might also mean walking past the child while both of you are invisible to one another. It might leave younger children alone at home. It might strand the searching parent halfway between two shelters. This was the brutal mathematics of a whiteout. Good intentions did not create visibility. That is why local knowledge was so important. Families knew where children were normally supposed to go if conditions worsened. Teachers boarded with local households and often knew the nearest farms. Neighbours knew one another's routines. After the 1888 storm, survivor Ellen Rennerfelt remembered that several children remained at her family's home for days until their own parents could retrieve them. From the parents' perspective, those children were absent, but they were safe. Searching during the worst part of the storm might have added danger without improving the children's situation at all. The opposite could also happen. A person might genuinely be stranded outside and have only a limited time before cold injury made self-rescue impossible. Now waiting became dangerous. There was no formula that solved this. Settlers had to judge wind, temperature, distance, daylight, the missing person's likely route, available clothing, available animals, and whether another capable adult could accompany the search. Even then, the answer might be wrong. That uncertainty is one reason the hero stories from Plains blizzards became so powerful afterward. Teachers, parents, children, and neighbours sometimes made extraordinary attempts to save one another. Minnie Freeman's rescue of 13 pupils after the roof of her Nebraska schoolhouse was torn away became one of the best-known examples. Historical accounts emphasize that many other acts of courage occurred during the same storm, some of them ending successfully and others ending in death. But heroism could not become the general survival rule. If everyone left shelter whenever someone was missing, the casualty count could become much worse. So the practical question was narrower. What do we know? Where was the person last seen? What route would they probably use? Is there a strong shelter along that route? Has the wind weakened? Is there daylight? Can we follow a physical guide? Can two people search more safely than one? Can we reach the first checkpoint and return without losing orientation? This is where settlers' familiar landscape became a search system. A fence could divide the journey into known segments. A creek bank could provide direction. A row of trees could lead toward a house. Railroad tracks could guide movement when roads vanished. A barn, schoolhouse, windmill, grove, or other large feature could become a checkpoint. The searcher did not need to see the final destination. The searcher needed to avoid losing the next reliable reference. That same principle appeared in survivor accounts we have already encountered. People followed cottonwoods, rails, buildings, and other physical features because sight alone could not be trusted. Travel without such a guide was far more dangerous. One autobiographical Nebraska account describes a man riding through a December 1878 blizzard in which blowing snow reduced visibility to roughly 100 feet. He continued and reached his destination. But the account is valuable precisely because it shows how little visibility could remain even for someone who successfully completed the journey. Success did not make the journey safe. It meant the risk happened to end well. That distinction matters whenever we read frontier memories. Survivors tell the stories. The person who took the same chance and froze cannot explain the decision decades later. This creates a kind of historical illusion. We hear many stories about remarkable rides, desperate walks, animals finding their way home, and children reaching shelter. Those events happened, but we should not convert survival into proof that the decision was wise. Sometimes a person survived a bad decision. Sometimes a person died after making a reasonable one. The weather did not reward moral character. That is why experienced communities slowly learn to place more value on prevention than rescue. If a threatening change was noticed early, children could remain at school before travel became dangerous. Animals could be sheltered before someone had to search for them. Travelers could stop at the nearest house instead of attempting the final miles home. Neighbors could assume that anyone caught away from home might remain sheltered where they were. Each of these decisions reduced the number of people who would later need to be found. The safest rescue happened before anyone became missing. Still, storms inevitably produced situations where people had to move. Then preparation became personal. The searcher needed the warmest available clothing. Hands had to remain usable. A rope might be carried. A horse might help, but animals could also become exhausted or disoriented. Someone inside should know where the searcher intended to go. The route should be limited, and there had to be a point at which the search was abandoned. That final condition may have been the hardest. To turn around while another person remained missing could feel like cowardice. In reality, it could be the decision that allowed the search to resume when visibility improved. Great Plains communities understood this more clearly after repeated winter disasters. Once the storm weakened, neighbors could organize, routes could be checked systematically, survivors could be transported, search areas could widen without every participant operating blindly. And after a major storm, those searches sometimes continued for days because the physical evidence remained hidden beneath drifts. The 1888 blizzard became part of collective Nebraska memory precisely because survivors continued recounting not only what happened during the storm, but how families and communities endured the aftermath. This gives us one of the least glamorous but most important rules in the entire story. Survival was not always doing everything possible. Sometimes it was doing only what could be done without destroying the next chance to act. Protect the people already sheltered. Keep the stove burning. Preserve strength. Wait for visibility. Then search. That discipline explains why the Great Plains settlers' real defense against a blizzard was never one miraculous skill. It was a sequence of decisions. Prepare before the storm. Recognize the change. Reduce movement. Protect heat. Stay oriented. Share shelter. Search when the odds improve. Recover afterward. Then remember what failed. And by the end of the 19th century, those lessons were beginning to combine with something earlier generations had never possessed on the same scale. Organized weather observation, faster communications, railroads, telephones, and increasingly systematic forecasting. The prairie was still dangerous, but people were gradually changing the balance. And that brings us to the final question. After all the ropes, Sod walls, stored food, tree rows, weather signs, telegraph warnings, and terrible lessons learned from storms like 1888. What actually made survival possible when the forecasts never reached the door? Not one trick, not one kind of house, and certainly not an almost supernatural ability to look at the sky and know exactly what would happen next. Great Plains settlers survived by building margins between an ordinary winter problem and a fatal one. A few extra hours of fuel were a margin. Water carried inside before the wind rose was a margin. A sack of flour was a margin. Heavy boots worn on a deceptively mild morning were a margin. A barn close enough to reach safely was a margin. A fence, rail, tree row, or rope that could still be followed after the horizon disappeared was a margin. A neighbour willing to shelter children was another. None of these guaranteed survival. Together, they gave people more chances to make the next correct decision. The Schoolchildren's blizzard of January 12, 1888 demonstrated why those margins mattered so much. In Nebraska, unusually mild conditions preceded the sudden arrival of powerful northwest winds, severe cold, and blinding snow. Children were already at school, adults were working, and cattle were outside when conditions changed. The storm became remembered as the Schoolchildren's blizzard precisely because so many young people were caught away from home. That disaster also destroys one of the easiest myths about frontier survival. Experience alone was not enough. Someone could have lived on the plains for years and still be caught at the wrong place at the wrong hour. A teacher could know the road home perfectly and lose it. A farmer could understand winter weather and still be surprised by the speed of a cold front. A traveller could be only a short distance from shelter and never see it. This was why orientation mattered so much. When sight failed, settlers substituted things that could be touched or physically followed. A fence, railroad tracks, a row of trees, a rope, the side of a building. The objective was not to navigate beautifully. It was to keep one mistake from becoming permanent. Shelter worked the same way. A sod house was not comfortable merely because later generations sometimes romanticized it. It could be dirty, damp, cramped, and difficult to maintain. But thick earth walls reduced direct exposure to the wind. A dugout used the thermal mass of the ground. A barn, haystack, or protected bank could become emergency shelter when a proper house was unreachable. The goal was always the same: get out of moving air, preserve body heat, buy time. Then came fuel. A warm house without enough fuel was only temporary shelter, so settlers burned what their environment provided or what they could afford: wood where available, coal in some areas, corn cobs, twisted hay, and dried animal dung where conventional firewood was scarce. Fuel meant much more than comfort. It kept people warm. It cooked food. It heated water. It dried clothing. It made snow usable as emergency water. And because obtaining more fuel might require going outside, the location of that fuel mattered almost as much as the quantity. That principle appeared everywhere. The safest supply was the supply already within reach. The safest water was already inside. The safest livestock were already sheltered. The safest child was already in a warm building. The safest traveller had already stopped. This is perhaps the biggest difference between cinematic frontier survival and real frontier survival. The dramatic version begins when someone walks into the blizzard. The practical version begins several hours earlier, when someone decides not to. Survivors repeatedly benefited from reducing movement once conditions became dangerous. Nebraska's historical record of the 1888 storm contains both successful rescues and terrible losses, particularly among children and teachers forced into decisions about whether to remain in schoolhouses or attempt nearby shelter. There was no universal command that could solve every case. Stay inside could be correct until the roof failed. Move could be necessary until visibility vanished. Search for someone could save a life, or create another missing person. That meant survival was fundamentally a decision problem. What is failing first? Shelter? Fuel? Water? Clothing? Visibility? The condition of the person? The weather itself? The person who could identify the most immediate danger had the best chance of choosing between bad options. And increasingly, settlers were adding another layer to those decisions. Information. By the late 19th century, the United States had an organized weather observation and warning network. Telegraph communication allowed information about developing weather to move far faster than horses or trains could carry it. But the system remained incomplete. The January 1888 storm in the Black Hills provides an almost perfect example. A cold wave warning was issued from the signal office in St. Paul, but the Western Union telegraph line failed as the storm arrived, preventing that warning from reaching Rapid City in time. Rail transportation was also blocked by snow for days. The forecast existed. The last mile failed. That is why the title of our story matters. Great Plains settlers did not always survive without forecasting, because forecasting literally did not exist. By the later settlement period, forecasts existed. What many rural families lacked was reliable, immediate access to them. A warning posted in town might as well have been 100 miles away if you were already inside a schoolhouse surrounded by blowing snow. So local survival knowledge remained essential even as meteorology improved. People watched the sky. They watched wind direction. They listened to neighbours. They remembered previous storms. They stored food. They kept fuel. They planted trees. They improved houses and barns. They learned where snow drifted. They learned when roads became dangerous. And after every severe winter, the landscape became a kind of notebook. Here is where the snow piles. Here is where the fence disappears. Here is the house that stays warm. Here is the route children should not take. Here is the neighbour who has a strong barn. Here is where someone died. Memory turned catastrophe into preparation. That may be the most important survival technology in this entire story. Not the stove. Not the telegraph. Not the sod wall. Memory, because each generation of settlers did not begin completely from zero. A child who survived the blizzard of 1888 could remember it for the rest of a lifetime. Decades later, survivors were still gathering and preserving their accounts. In 1940, Nebraska survivors organized the January 12, 1888 Blizzard Club specifically around the memory of that storm. They remembered because forgetting had consequences. And gradually, all those layers began to overlap. Better weather observations, better communications, better roads and railroads, more substantial houses, more dependable barns, stored hay, windbreaks, community experience. The Great Plains never became harmless. A blizzard could still kill. Modern forecasts do not abolish winter either. What changed was the amount of warning and the number of defences standing between the first sign of danger and the final mistake. For the 19th century settler, that space was much smaller. Sometimes only a few minutes. Sometimes only a few yards. A teacher keeping children inside. A mother insisting on boots. A farmer deciding the cattle could wait. A traveller stopping at the nearest farmhouse rather than attempting the final mile. A family carrying in one more bucket of water before closing the door. Small decisions. Ordinary decisions. Usually made by people who had no idea anyone would still be talking about them more than a century later. And perhaps that is the quietest truth about how Great Plains settlers survived blizzards without dependable weather forecasts. They did not conquer the storm. They made themselves harder for the storm to kill. Layer by layer, winter by winter, mistake by remembered mistake, until the stove was burning, the animals were sheltered, the food was stored, and the wind outside could howl across the dark prairie without requiring anyone inside to answer it. And for tonight, that is where we can leave them. Inside the small circle of lamplight, snow pressed against the walls, the road gone completely, the fields invisible, but the fire still alive, the water within reach, and everyone who made it home waiting quietly for morning.